Good morning, and thank you for coming. It's an honor to be here and to have you attend this conference. It's very gratifying to be able to discuss these things with like-minded people and be able to share some ideas. To get started, I'd like to talk about agency-based education and ending compulsory education. You've all heard of Government Motors, otherwise known as GM, or formerly known as GM. Did you hear the news this past week? The government floated the idea that because of the high standards and safety features in GM vehicles, unless you apply for and successfully receive a waiver, you'll be required to purchase a GM vehicle going forward. I don't know if you heard about that. They also, the government said they're going to standardize all car engines to one particular model because it doesn't really make sense that you would have 50 different car engines for 50 different cars. They all work the same way. They have one purpose, and if we just fit them into any type of vehicle, they'll all work the same. So, of course, these things are ridiculous, but that doesn't stop us from accepting things like No Child Left Behind and Common Core. Now, what's more important than eternal salvation? No child of God left behind, right? If compulsory education is so important to make sure that people are educated, shouldn't we be finding churches that promise eternal salvation so that every child of God can be saved as well? I mean, it just makes sense, right? I mean, what could be more important than eternal salvation? Well, obviously not. So why do we tolerate compulsory education if we don't tolerate compulsory market decisions or compulsory religion? There's a psychiatrist, and I'm not sure how to say his last name, Thomas Szasz. He was an interesting individual. He got in trouble with his own profession for speaking out and challenging some of their practices. And this is what he said about compulsory education. He said, "Compulsory education is the chink in the armor of capitalist societies. They try to teach children the values of contract and initiative, but base their educational system on compulsion and conformity. Communist societies suffer from no such inconsistency. They try to teach their children command and obedience, and their educational system is consistent with inculcating this ethic." Pretty insightful. Investor's Business Daily, I'm not sure when this appeared in their paper, but they shared this chart, which is based on information from the U.S. Department of Education. And they know investments, good and bad, when they see them, and they could tell this was a bad investment. Since the 1970s, public school employment has increased at 10 times the rate of enrollments. We've doubled the amount of staff with student populations increasing about 8%. Federal spending has increased 375% during this period of time, but learning hasn't moved. If you pay more, shouldn't you get more? I mean, we expect that with cars, computers, food, and things of that nature, so why don't we get that from education? Most of you have probably heard of Frédéric Bastiat. He was a French philosopher that wrote a series of articles in the newspapers of his time challenging the notions of socialism. And those were compiled into a collection that we have published today. It's been around for a long, long time, and it's called The Law. I recommend everybody read this book. It's a relatively short book, but he had some phenomenal ideas on freedom and why socialism is nothing more than a religion of greed. And he said, as long as these socialist ideas prevail, it is clear that the responsibility of government is enormous. It is burdened with everything. It undertakes everything. It does everything. Therefore, it is responsible for everything. In creating a monopoly of education, the government must answer to the hopes of the fathers of families who have been thus deprived of their liberty. And if these hopes are shattered, whose fault is it? It's a penetrating question. If the government takes the responsibility from citizens, it must also shoulder the blame for failure because citizens had no choice in the matter. Isn't it interesting today that schools say, well, we want parental involvement. We want to have you involved in the education process, but at the same time, they're taking that responsibility away from parents, saying, we're going to do this. We're going to teach your children what we know is best for them. And then they expect us to just follow along. So I want to give a real brief history on compulsory education and share a few quotes with you. A lot could be said about this, but I'm going to keep this relatively short. Compulsory education started prior to the Prussian system of the early 1800s, but they were the ones that kind of perfected and systematized the education system. And among the things that they implemented were compulsory attendance, specific training for teachers, national testing for all students, which was used to identify which students would be classified for different types of jobs, and national curriculum set for each grade, and mandatory kindergarten. So it's pretty clear where our current system of education came from because it matches all of this. The foundation of the Prussian system was built on these principles, that humans were nothing more than scientific objects. There's only a brain, body, and a nervous system. There's no God, there's no spirit, and it was a stimulus-response system. It wasn't an educational system, it was a psychological system. The core of their system was driven by the belief that there is no God, there is no spirit. Therefore, whatever is happening is nothing more than a stimulus-response experience. So if we stimulate properly, we're going to get the proper response that we want from these children in the education system. In Latin, the root word that became education for us is eductus, I guess is how you might say that. It means to lead forth or develop the faculties. So in classical education, the purpose of it was to draw out the talents and abilities and impart knowledge and reasoning to the students. But under the Prussian system, it became, we need to give them meaningful experiences that produce desired reactions. It was literally to shape the youths according to desired outcomes. So they set up a university in Leipzig, Germany. At the time it was Prussia. And among the people who came there to receive training in this philosophy were Horace Mann, G. Stanley Hall, who was John Dewey's mentor, and Ivan Pavlov, best known for making dogs salivate when he rang a school bell. It might have been a school bell. That's the type of educational thinking that was going on here. If we just stimulate them properly, they're going to respond. And so these people, in turn, implemented these types of educational practices wherever they went. Horace Mann was the first one to bring this Prussian system to the United States. He instituted compulsory education in Massachusetts, and I'm going to share a couple of quotes here that he gave. "We who are engaged in the sacred cause of education are entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause." Not exactly pro-family. Another quote, "Having found the present generation composed of materials almost unmalleable, I am about transferring my efforts to the next. Men are cast iron, but children are wax. Strength expended upon the latter may be effectual, which would make no impression upon the former." The target is always children, because they're the ones that can be shaped. They haven't developed their moral system, their values. They're taken from their families at an early age before they have a chance for that value system to set in. Another quote from him, "What the church has been for medieval man, the public school must become for democratic and rational man. God will be replaced by the concept of the public good. The common schools shall create a more far-seeing intelligence and a pure morality than has ever existed among communities of men." So in essence, our schools are to replace churches as belief centers. John Dewey then opened in 1896 the Dewey School, which was later known as the Laboratory School of the University of Chicago, appropriately named Laboratory School. This is where Dewey was going to implement more of the Prussian model of scientific behavior training on the world of education. He was one of the original 34 signatories on the Humanist Manifesto in 1933, which was essentially a communist manifesto look-alike that was basically exalting man over God. It was an atheistic document. And it also self-described itself as a religion. Dewey was not an educator. He was a social engineer. And this was his purpose in life. We regard him heavily today as an educator because that's what we've been told, but he wasn't. That was not his background. He was a social engineer. Dewey said, quote, "The school is primarily a social institution. Education being a social process, The school is simply that form of community life in which all those agencies are concentrated that will be most effective in bringing the child to share in the inherited resources of the race and to use his own powers for social ends. In other words, schools are gathering places to funnel children into socialistic thought that supersedes the individual. They wanted to create these centers where everybody became interested in the public good. John Goodlad in our day is a disciple of John Dewey. He won the John Dewey Award, and back in the 1980s, he created the National Network for Educational Renewal. The NNER is an entity that helps universities interface with the local public schools so that the training that happens for university professors, which is all steeped in the Dewey-Goodlad philosophy, the Prussian system, then filters into the public schools where they teach children these concepts in this manner. And then as they graduate from school, they go to college, many of them become teachers, and it becomes a cyclical type of relationship. So I want to share a couple quotes from Goodlad. Quote, "Most youth still hold the same values of their parents. If we do not alter this pattern, if we don't resocialize, our system will decay." Another quote, "Public education has served as a check on the power of parents, and this is another powerful reason for maintaining it." To Goodlad, our schools in Utah, they have embraced this philosophy. They're nothing more than re-indoctrination centers to serve as a check on the power of parents. How do they do that? Well, compulsory education, in which we have no say in what is being taught or how it's being taught to our children. Another quote from Goodlad, "Enlightened social engineering is required to face situations that demand global action now. Parents and the general public must be reached also. Otherwise, children and youth enrolled in globally oriented programs may find themselves in conflict with values assumed in the home. And then the educational institution frequently comes under scrutiny and must pull back." Well, duh. That's what we've been doing for the last few years, is watching our children go through this and rising up saying, these are not our values. This is not what we want our children to be taught. But Goodlad has just completely opened up their strategy is we've got to embrace the parents. We've got to teach parents as well. Otherwise, the values that children receive in the home are going to come in conflict with what we're trying to do in the schools. And this is actually happening. In Utah, there are now 21st century community centers that are designed to bring parents in to help them understand and be a part of the training of their children in these philosophies. John Taylor Gatto, he was a New York City teacher. In fact, 3 times the New York City Teacher of the Year. That's kind of a large area, and that's pretty prestigious for him to have won this Teacher of the Year award 3 separate times. I want to read kind of a lengthy statement from his third acceptance speech. Shortly after that, he resigned as a public school teacher. This guy was a little bit like Zos earlier, who questioned his own profession after he began to look into its history. And when he saw what was happening with compulsory education and the background and some of the things that I've just presented, he saw them for what they are. And so he spoke out against it and then, like I said, eventually resigned from the teaching public schools. So this is 5 slides. Apologize again, a little long. But I want to enter this into the record, so to speak. Our form of compulsory schooling is an invention of the state of Massachusetts around 1850. It was resisted, sometimes with guns, by an estimated 80% of the Massachusetts population. The last outpost in Barnstable on Cape Cod not surrendering its children until the 1880s when the area was seized by militia and children marched to school under guard. Now here is a curious idea to ponder. Senator Ted Kennedy's office released a paper not too long ago, this was in 1990 that he said this, claiming that prior to compulsory education, the state literacy rate was 98%, and after it, the figure never again reached above 91% where it stands in 1990. I hope that interests you. Here's another curiosity to think about. The homeschooling movement has quietly grown to a size where 1.5 million young people are being educated entirely by their own parents. Last month, the education press reported the amazing news that children schooled at home seem to be 5 or even 10 years ahead of their formally trained peers in their ability to think. I don't think we'll get rid of schools anytime soon, certainly not in my lifetime. But if we're going to change what is rapidly becoming a disaster of ignorance, we need to realize that the school institution schools very well, but it does not educate. That's inherent in the design of the thing. It's not the fault of bad teachers or too little money spent. It's just impossible for education and schooling ever to be the same thing. Schools were designed by Horace Mann and Bernard Sears and Harper of the University of Chicago and Thorndike of Columbia Teachers College and some other men to be instruments of the scientific management of a mass population. Schools are intended to produce, through the application of formulae, formulaic human beings whose behavior can be predicted and controlled. It's all about science. And unless educators look into their own profession's history like Gatto did, they'll never see the system for what it is, what it used to be, and what's happening right now, which is the greatest experiment ever devised to bring children to commonality and a loss of individuality. This isn't saying that teachers are bad or have nefarious intentions. It's the system itself. And when someone feels the urge to become a teacher, they enter the system, and in many cases, they've grown up in public education, they're used to it, they fully accept the Dewey Goodlad philosophy and programming, and so we can't blame teachers. It's just the system, and the system itself needs a course correction. So what is the goal of education? I think everybody would say the goal is educating children to their fullest potential, but there's a huge gulf between the objective and what's being done in society to bring it about. Our goal is more divergent in nature, where parents' and children's needs are met according to the individuality of the child and their interests and talents. The system, though, is designed to be convergent, stamping out children schooled in the same way, shaping behavior and content regardless of their interests or the needs of the family. So what is this? It's bubble wrap. Actually, it's compulsory education laws that wrap up public education in a protective bubble to prevent it from market forces that would shatter its monopoly on children. Remember Barnstable, Massachusetts, where children were marched to school by the militia. That's bubble wrap around government schools. I want to share a true story. This happened in Utah. It was reported in the press about a month or two ago, and it illustrates the power of the state over our lives. So there's a truant student. She was constantly late for school, and the district decided they were going to send her to juvenile court. So they did. The court ordered this young lady to be in class, to do her homework, to maintain C's or higher. The court ordered the mother to attend parenting classes. The court ordered the girl to attend summer school. The court ordered her to read a book every other week. And then the court ordered the mother to wrap up all of her makeup and bring it to the probation officer and force her to go to school without wearing makeup because her behavior hadn't changed. This is a true story. She then broke. She started attending school on time. Her grades came up, and in essence, she was a newly shaped citizen that was obedient to the will of the state. All this because truancy laws create a state ownership of children. The mother was quoted in this article as saying, "I want to thank Your Honor because this experience is the best thing that could have happened to us." The superintendent of the school district said, "We never give up on a child. We're always trying to help them succeed." I don't remember the last time I was so offended on a moral level by reading a story. It's like something out of Orwell's 1984. So this is what's happening. This isn't the only story. In Utah, kindergartners have been sent to truancy court. Utah high schoolers have been fined for being truant. So we'll take their money. You're late. You're wasting our time. We'll take your money. In Houston, I found this out-of-state story really interesting. A Houston judge jailed a girl named Diane Tran. She was 17 years old, and for missing too much school, they jailed her and fined her $100. She was an 11th grade honor student who was working 2 jobs to support siblings after her parents divorced and moved out of state. These are the things that are happening in our country. So what are the costs of compulsory education? Utah handles a couple thousand truancy cases a year. That's expensive. I think those resources could be put to a lot better use elsewhere. But how about the bigger cost of what's happening in the mind and spirit of our children? Imagine turning a couple thousand children into criminals each year because they didn't do something you felt was good for them. What's the effect of forcing our will on children? I can tell you in my household, it doesn't go over very well. I've tried it numerous times. My kids don't seem to respond overly well to that. But instead, persuasion, if done right, can bring somebody to a proper outcome and making a good choice in life. There's no difference when society says to a child, we're going to force you down this path, instead of persuading them why it's the right thing for them and creating an environment where they can grow and excel. Sorry, I think I misstated that. The difference there is broad in the mind of the child. When the society forces their will upon the child, it's vastly different, and that's where we get a lot of behavior issues in our society. In the Utah Code section 62A, it says, quote, under both the United States Constitution and the Constitution of this state, a parent possesses a fundamental liberty interest in the care, custody, and management of the parent's children. Further down it says, the state recognizes that a parent has the right, obligation, responsibility, and authority to raise, manage, train, educate, provide for, and reasonably discipline the parent's children, and the state's role is secondary and supportive to the primary role of a parent. How can the state's role be secondary to that of the parent if the state has power to compel parents to parenting classes and students to public schools? Utah is living a lie. The state has contradictory laws where truancy trumps a parent's fundamental liberty interest in the management of their children. So what's the proper role of law? The state makes laws. Laws represent force. And the proper use of government force is to protect life, liberty, or property. So whose life, liberty, or property is being protected when we implement truancy laws that trump parents' fundamental liberty interest? It's only one answer. The state owns children. It doesn't have a fundamental liberty interest in the education of our children, but they claim ownership of our children as if they are property through truancy laws for the good of society. Parents become secondary to the state. So here's a little analysis of the reasoning behind truancy laws. Okay, you have good parents, and everybody knows there's bad parents, right? We have a compulsory based education system, and you could have an agency-based system that was free will. So under a compulsory-based system with good parents, everybody knows children are going to become educated. You've got good parents, they're going to make sure you're being taught what you need to know. But if you remove compulsory education laws, you increase parental responsibility, authority, and participation. Teachers and schools are always saying, well, we want parents to be involved more. Well, let's get them involved more. Remove the compulsion and let parents convince their kids why it's a good idea to go to school. And you create an environment where our kids want to come because they know they're going to learn something. So what happens under a compulsory-based system with bad parents? Because this is where the example always goes to. And they say things like, oh, there's bad parents out there. There's going to be children that don't get educated. We have to force them to school. No child left behind. We can't do it. We have to make sure that those kids get to school and get educated. Well, in essence, in creating compulsory education laws and truancy laws, the state is saying there's no such thing as a good parent because all parents need this. You have to force those kids to school. So what about bad parents and agency-based systems? Well, they'll say, oh, they're going to become criminals and a burden on society. That's at least what I've heard. Newsflash, that's already happening. Doesn't matter if it's a compulsory-based education system, it's already taking place. There's a great little book called The Leipzig Connection. If you remember back to the slides on Prussian education, that was the university they set up in Prussia. The Leipzig Connection is a book by Paolo Leone. It's in the handout as well, so you have a reference to it. But he documents in his book how this compulsory education system under psychological, scientific approaches actually led to juvenile delinquency. Compulsory education is the cause, not the cure, of juvenile delinquency. Thomas Jefferson made many great statements, but I love this one. He said, quote, "Is it a right or a duty in society to take care of their infant members in opposition to the will of the parent? How far does this right and duty extend? To guard the life of the infant, his property, his instruction, his morals? We draw a line, but where? It is better to tolerate the rare instance of a parent refusing to let his child be educated than to shock the common feelings and ideas by the forcible asportation and education of the infant against the will of the father. If the state feels that it can solve the problems of society by force, then there's no power to do good outside the reach of government. We see that everywhere we turn. So what are some of the benefits of ending compulsory education and truancy laws? Number one, children that aren't forced to go to school, get to choose to become educated. They get to see what happens. Parents get to parent them and help them understand the value of an education. It flips the argument. It's sort of pointless for somebody to say to one of their classmates at school how much they hate school, how much they hate the teacher, how much they hate their homework when they have the choice to be there. Their peers would be saying, well, if you don't like it, why are you here? 2, teachers have classrooms of children who are there to learn. They're not being forced to stay there. They're not being compelled to stay there. A teacher can kick a disruptive kid out of their class. It helps end behavior issues. 3, parents have to parent again. No substitutes accepted. The state cannot take control of your children. They can't force them to maintain a certain grade level. They can't force them to read a book every 2 weeks. They can't force them to give up their makeup and attend school without makeup. Another one, the state saves money, shifts truancy expenses to other areas. I mean, 1,500 to 2,000 court cases a year has to be pretty expensive. I think we could use that to solve some other problems in society and put that money to good use. We don't need to make a couple thousand kids a year criminals. And there's many other reasons that would come about making some of these changes as well. So what are some steps toward true local control of education, which is really the family? Number one, if we return local control of education, standards, curriculum, and assessments to local districts and charter schools, that's a step in the right direction, because then the people at the local level who have coordination ability with families in that area have the ability to decide what their standards are going to be, how they want their kids tested, if they want them tested, what kind of homework they want for their kids. We don't need to standardize 50 different car engines and say one will fit. Second, we need to sever all ties to national and global entities involved in education. The federal government, the United Nations, they're both heavily involved in education efforts. By cutting those ties and saying we can do it ourselves locally, there are very inexpensive solutions. As you're going to hear shortly, there's some presentations coming up that are going to talk about this. Cheaper than public schools, and I believe vastly superior. And last, repeal compulsory education laws. It's time that we end truancy, end compulsory education. There's no reason for it except to impose the will of the state over the fundamental liberty interest of the parent in the raising of their children. and it will allow parenting to return to its proper position, which is in the home. I want to close with this quote by Frederick Bastiat. These are the last two paragraphs in his book, The Law. Clips out of them. He said, quote, "God has given to men all that is necessary for them to accomplish their destinies. Persons are so constituted that they will develop themselves harmoniously in the clean air of liberty. And now that the legislators and do-gooders have so futilely inflicted so many systems upon society, may they finally end where they should have begun. May they reject all systems and try liberty. For liberty is an acknowledgement of faith in God and His works." I believe it's time to end compulsory education and acknowledge that what God has created is capable of so much more in an environment of liberty. Thank you for listening. I guess I've got time for a question or two if anybody has a question, and then we'll have Jack up here. Are there? Yes. She wasn't providing any education at home. Correct. So I mean, that parent is default. Exactly, and that was maybe I needed to make that point a little stronger. But the if I back up here to this slide, under an agency-based system, when you have parents, it increases the responsibility and authority and their participation. So exactly what you said, that parent has to parent and has to say, look, this is your teacher. This is the person to whom, we're relying on you to have an educational experience with. And so that absolutely, the parent has to step up. I mean, that's to me, one of the great benefits of an agency-based education system is it forces the parent to step in. Right now, if you have compulsory education, since the responsibility is removed from the parent says, it's no big deal to me, the state's going to take care of it. We see the same thing with other things that government steps into, like, say, healthcare. Government steps into healthcare, I don't need to provide insurance for myself. So anything that the government steps into and subsidizes for us, we naturally retract from because it's being taken care of for us. Yes. Linda, yeah.
Maybe it would be instructive to add another couple columns, good teachers and bad teachers.
Good teachers and bad teachers column.
Under those two types of education.
You could extend this out, teachers, administrators, to a number of columns there. That's correct. Marjana? Yeah, teachers do need to become accountable to market forces. And that's the idea with the bubble wrap. If you insulate the system, there is no accountability. There's no market force that can penetrate that when you say, unless you're paying for a private education or homeschooling, we're going to take your kids and put them in a public school where our teachers are going to give your students what we want. But if you remove that and you say it's an agency-based, if I send my child to a teacher and that teacher's not teaching the times tables, for example, which happens in Utah. Those of you that know me, that's how I got started. So if I'm not going to send my child to that teacher, why should I? If they're not going to learn it, that teacher is going to become accountable to me as a parent because I'm going to interface with them. I'm going to say, look, I'm not going to send my child to your school unless you're teaching the things that I want. So listen to me instead of listening to the State Office of Education or the federal government or UNESCO and what they're telling you to teach my child. I'm in charge again as a parent. Janelle?
The way I interpreted that first comment was that if we have laws that make the teachers accountable for their students' work, is that now shifts the responsibility to the teacher, giving them more control over that student.
Right.
And so that it gives them the responsibility of making sure that student is in class. It just shifts the responsibility.
It does. When you remove the law, everything shifts more local. So the parents have a bigger responsibility to step up, but the teacher is going to become more accountable. And I'm sure everybody's seen Little House on the Prairie before and things. The teacher becomes more of a focus as well because it's not the system, it's who's actually benefiting my child? It's not the administration, it's not the state office, it's not the federal government, it's the teacher. So the teacher-parent relationship is going to improve naturally because of that difference. Yes?
Going back to that first statement also, I think that we haven't really, we didn't repeat exactly what she said. If you are going to take away compulsory education, you're leaving the teacher in charge to get in trouble. So you've also got to take away the laws that are making the teacher keep the student up and going so that the teacher's not the one getting in trouble also. So you've got to take away that law also.
Is that what you're saying? Okay, good. Awesome. Okay. So yes, we would need to relax that, and I totally agree with that as well. And in relaxing that, the teacher feels relief and more freedom and less constriction in what they can do as a teacher. It really turns back to more of a classical education. They can focus on the child and say, you know what, I can see that you're not getting this. Just stop doing this. You focus over here. That's what your parents want anyway. So I totally agree with that. Yes?
So what about the children, as a parent, what about the children who choose not to participate?
It's a great question. What about those children that choose not to participate? And there's two things I would say. One is Thomas Jefferson's statement here. It's not the right or the duty of society to take children forcibly from parents and put them in schools just because they feel that the state knows better. Okay. But second, it shifts things to a different level. So if you remove compulsory state education, who now becomes responsible for those children? If the parents are neglectful, well, the local community does. And that would be the churches, maybe at the neighborhood, city, township level. It just shifts that from the state to a local level because then people at the local level can get involved. If a school district says, you know what, if you're having difficulty getting your children to school, or we can see there's somebody not getting to school, neighbors know. So the churches, I mean, part of the reason that they wanted to implement public schools was to suppress religion, to do away with God, to do away with morals, to do away with parents' values, Judeo-Christian values. So if we re-enthrone that, which I think would be a natural outcome of having children educated in the way that their parents want, the moral values of society start to come up. Religious experiences may start to come up as well. Church attendance could start to come up. And from that local community, they could say, you know what, we can see there's a problem over here. This child needs some help. Let's go over and talk with the family, see if we can help interest their child. What are their child's interests? This is where true charity comes in. It gives people an opportunity to practice their religion. Whereas if the state does it, there's no reason. It's just like forced taxation. If you're taxed and then your money is given to charity under like the Bush compassionate charity doctrine, it doesn't do you any good. You haven't given of yourself. You're just, it's taken from me and it's going to a good cause. All right, I don't need to worry about that anymore. In the back here, yes.
We have a daughter that homeschools in Idaho, and they still have to register their students. And they have a core test for the standards that they have to pass, even though she provides the environment that you're talking and and she makes the whole program. But she still has the responsibility to the state to make sure those children are quote at grade level.
Right.
How do you address that?
What was that? Idaho. What? Removing compulsory education gets homeschoolers. They don't have to register anywhere. They're being homeschooled. There's no law that, if we remove truancy and compulsory education laws, there's nothing that would compel them to have to pass somebody else's test. There are things going on right now, which Elisa Ellis will maybe touch on this afternoon with Common Core, that are going to force private schoolers and homeschoolers to be tracked by the government according to some of the things going on. So any kind of barrier that we can put up that severs, like I said, national and global ties. We don't want to be tracked. We don't want to, have these tests and things that our kids are accountable to if we don't want them. Let parents decide when they want to test their kids, see what they know and what they don't. Janelle?
I was just going to say, in Utah, if you homeschool, you have to go fill out a paper at the school district saying that you are pulling your child. And that's a direct result of the truancy laws. And they're tracking, and there's just no way to get away from that.
Right.
The laws stand now.
Yeah. Yes.
Are you advocating that we have a complete separation between the schools and the government, or are you advocating that you continue to have taxpayer-funded schools, but people choose whether or not to use them, like a public library?
Yeah, the latter. Jefferson was in favor of public education, but not forced on anyone, and it was actually limited in duration. It wasn't K-12. It was, let's at least get them to a basic level of reading, writing, arithmetic, and if they choose to continue, their parents can pay for it. So let's educate all of society a bit to make sure that everybody has that opportunity, but they didn't force anybody to school. It was, this is provided for you. So I'm in favor of that, but I don't believe that it should be government controlled. I think it should be truly local education. I mean, so I guess in the realm of government funding, I'm not necessarily in favor of the government providing the schools to our kids. There's been different models used, and I think back then it certainly wasn't federally funded, but I think in Jefferson's day that the state of Virginia did fund the schools with some tax money, perhaps, but they also got donations. They went out and they got wealthy from society to say, hey, I'll sponsor some of these kids that don't have the funds to be able to attend school. So they did good. The giver was blessed and the receiver was blessed. They both knew who was helping, and that made both of them accountable to each other. So I think I don't see how we can unwind everything at this point to go back to that kind of day, but we can certainly take some steps, I think, in the right direction.
So what are you thinking about the content that is taught in these schools, be it compulsory or, because there's a lot of discussion that can go on about the content.
Yeah.
Children are just going on their own choice.
There's
They're being indoctrinated.
Yeah, there's going to be discussion on that this afternoon. Jared Carmen's going to talk a little about that. Lynn?
If we remove compulsory education, we will have fewer students who choose not to go to school under that system than we have now with dropouts.
Yeah, I believe that's right. He said, if any of you couldn't hear, if we remove compulsory education, we'll have fewer children choosing not to go to school than we have now with the amount of dropouts that we have. Did I state that right? Okay. Peter?
At the same time, it's important for us to all remember, if we love freedom, freedom is the freedom to fail. And if we do away with compulsory education, we just have to be prepared to accept or understand there will be children who are not sent to school, who will grow up with almost no education because of bad parenting. That is the cost of freedom. But the alternative is so much worse for us to continue to have our freedom taken away when we do want to be good parents. We do want to provide good education. We just have to understand freedom is the freedom to fail.
Right. And under compulsory education, we do have children going through schools that graduate without knowing anything.
What I'm hearing all through this between the thing that we can do the most to end this is to return to being accountable to God. Because what we're hearing over and over again is you must be accountable to somebody. And if they're not acknowledging that God is the ultimate that they are accountable to, they're going to try to supplant him, and they have.
That's exactly right. I love that you the way you said that, and I'm going to try and restate it so that it's recorded here. But we have to return accountability to God, because ultimately parents are accountable to God for the education of their children. And when the state removes that accountability, they're removing our accountability to God, because they're saying, we know what's best. No child left behind. We'll take care of it.
They're inserting themselves in God's place.
All will be saved.
I think it's interesting, it kind of fits in with this topic here, is that when you take your kids out of school to do homeschooling, nobody's, at least in my experience, was that nobody really thought they weren't going to get educated. Everybody was really concerned, hey, your kids are not going to be socialized correctly. It wasn't about education at all. It was, oh, you're not going to get socialized. So.
Yeah. Yes, one more.
For what it's worth in addressing his comment that some children would fall through the cracks, so to speak, I really believe that in a truly free educational system, where society as a whole becomes more educated, where it becomes more of a culture of going out on your own and finding what you need to know, those children are less likely to truly fall through the cracks because their friends, their neighbors, their society is a learning society. Whereas today, we have so many millions of children who fall through the cracks because they are being put through a system and no one sees how badly they're failing.
Yeah, that's a great comment.
And kids would know you could fail,
Yeah,
you could turn out really messed up in life, and they'll know that, therefore they are less likely to not really.
right. If they know there's no safety net for them, they're going to take a different approach to life. So thank you very much. We're going to have get set up for Jack to come up and speak.